3 years and 2 foreign delegations. I couldn't make that up. I couldn't make that up if I wanted to. Many other things I'd like to discuss, but I suppose the most important thing to touch upon is Afghanistan, because U.S.-Pakistan relations and Pakistan itself must be viewed in the context of Afghanistan, at least where we're coming from. When I try and put the pieces of this puzzle together and try and understand how the United States still provides this country with such aid in spite of all this evidence that is constantly being thrown at our face about some of the nefarious practices that some in the Pakistani government, some, not all, some in the Pakistani government are involved in, it really comes down to Afghanistan. That's the dirty little secret, is that we cannot do much until the Afghan war is over. Everyone is familiar with the drones operated by the CIA that hunt militants in Pakistan's tribal areas. Those are launched from within Pakistan, with Pakistan's consent. Pakistan patrols the border, the Afghan-Pakistan border. They don't do a very good job of securing it, but if they wanted to, they could make it a lot worse. And they provide the United States with intelligence, usually when it benefits them, when one of the militant groups that they've harbored and brought up over the years decides to turn its guns inward. Then the Pakistanis say, okay, we got to crack down on these guys, here's the intel, go get them. But most importantly, it's because of logistics. Supplying 100,000 coalition troops in Afghanistan several thousand miles away in desolate territory is a difficult task. And the United States, it used to be that some 80% of all our supplies went through Pakistan on 2 road links. The United States, we've done just about as much as we can to get that percentage down. We've opened up a northern distribution network through Central Asia and Russia. We have continued to airlift supplies in. We maintain an air base at Manas in Kyrgyzstan. But even with all that, we've been able to bring Pakistan's share of the logistics down to about 50%, and it just doesn't look like it can go much lower than that, just destined by geography. So until there is a change in the Afghan war, until the United States reduces its presence there, which will happen, there's not much that it can do to fundamentally change its relationship with Pakistan. We are hamstrung, and again, I'd quote from a piece that I will have out soon. We are hamstrung in facing a terrible dilemma. Confront Pakistan forcefully and risk suddenly and critically undermining the Afghan war effort, or continue playing the friendly benefactor and let Islamabad gradually undermine the war effort anyway. Most places refer to this as blackmail. In Washington, we call it a strategic partnership. And with some time, I'd also like to address China. China, as Vijay mentioned, is an interest of mine. Sino-Indian relations, fascinating. Nobody in the United States knows about them or cares. You'd think maybe the 2 largest countries in the world and how they interact with one another would be a topic of interest for the global superpower, but nobody seems to mind much. As many of you know, the last few years have been a time of heightened tensions between India and China. I don't want to overblow those tensions because there's still, diplomatic relations are still very much cordial. Economic trade continues to grow. Wen Jiabao was just in India in December. He brought 400 business executives with him. Trade has ballooned to $60 billion a year now. They've set a goal for $100 billion a year in 2015. But the most contentious issues between India and China were not addressed during Wen Jiabao's visit. And just to touch on some of these briefly, the stapled visas. I'm sure many of you have heard about the stapled visas issue. That goes back to 2007 when the Chinese said there was an Indian officer from Arunachal Pradesh who was to visit China, and the Chinese said no, this visa is illegitimate. Citizens from their own country don't need visas to visit China. And obviously a snub to India saying, challenging their sovereignty over Arunachal Pradesh. India, they had been stapling visas for citizens from Arunachal for a while, stapling them to a separate piece of paper as a way of saying, look, okay, Arunachal's a different status. It's not really an Indian state. We haven't decided what what's going on with that yet. And then in 2009, they began doing it for Kashmiri residents too. And this raised a big furor in New Delhi, understandably, because it is essentially challenging Indian sovereignty over Kashmir. There's no need for to have a separate operation for Indian citizens from there unless you are trying to make a political point. And actually, very recently, they denied an Indian general from Kashmir a visa. So India's response was to suspend defense exchanges, which is understandable. Kashmir itself is an issue that some had hoped Wen Jiabao and Indian officials would be able to address. And there was again no progress. China has been upgrading the Karakoram Highway in Pakistani-controlled Kashmir. China has plans to build 2 nuclear power plants in Pakistan. This is actually in contravention of its obligations. China joined the Nuclear Suppliers Group in 2004, and it promised not to supply nuclear materials to countries outside of the proliferation regime, like Pakistan. Now it's trying to go back on those words. The border disputes. I mentioned Arunachal Pradesh already. Cross-border forays. Some of you may be familiar with Brahma Chalani. He's a prominent Indian scholar. He has stated that between 2006 and 2009, cross-border forays went from 140 to 270. Those are cross-border incursions by Chinese patrols. Some of them, certainly innocent. Some of them minor provocations. Used to support that role for India. Perhaps the most significant thing was that in the joint statement that came out of this visit, India, for the first time, did not mention Tibet and Taiwan. This is a method as indisputable parts of China. So that's representative of perhaps a shift in Indian policy in that have been plaguing India and China. I could certainly address them in Q&A if you like. I'd just note that my growing understanding of China is that there are it is one-party rule, but there are competing centers of power within that one-party rule, and some people see a growing division for China, both in its region and abroad, and have become more aggressive in their calls for China to do so. So I think it's going to be important to watch how that dynamic plays out in the future. India certainly will have India will feel the effects of that internal dynamic and that internal struggle. But I'd like to stop there and just leave as much time for Q&A as possible. I'd prefer to be exchanging views with the audience than lecturing. I don't know
Well, friends, you'll agree that it was indeed a very stimulating talk. And I think very, very, very openly sympathetic to what I would say an Indian position. I would now request my friend Sri to come up and do the Q&A. But I would like to tell you that I promise you many, many more such wonderful speakers, but on one condition. And what is that condition? I would like somebody here in the audience to tell me. I expect punctuality. You can't be coming in, strolling in when the guest speaker is very much. I want you to respect the timings, but I promise you on my part that we will have such wonderful speakers here for you time and time again. Sri.
Smith. I believe you're also going to eat while we talk, so we're going to watch you eat. Please. So that's going to be fine. And I hope you'll all save some food for both of us. Maybe it would be helpful for everyone. So I'm going to ask him a couple of questions, and then obviously would like all of you to ask a question. So maybe you tell us a little bit about your own interest in India and how you got that and where you studied. And you certainly know a lot more about India than, be fair to say, many of us in the room. And you study it in a way that many of us don't. So talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I came into studying and focusing on South Asia as a graduate student. I was an undergraduate when 9/11 happened, and I was already in international affairs program, studying political science, international security. So I was naturally drawn to the threat from Islamist terrorism and Islamist ideology. Unfortunately, this drew me to Pakistan, where I found much of, along with, at the time, Saudi Arabia, much of the energy behind Islamist extremist activity was being generated. But in my course of studying Pakistan, I began to notice there was a gigantic country alongside it with very much in common with the United States that I didn't hear anybody talking about. There was no India studies programs in the United States. India was not a hot topic on the radar. You know, unfortunately in Washington, we tend to focus on threats. So if a country was not a threat to us, we didn't much wonder about what was going on there. But the more and more I learned about India, the more interesting it became. You know, I saw common threads with the United States in their independence movement. I became fascinated by their ability to hold together a democracy. You know, I'll never forget, the United Nations puts out these standards on what, you know, preconditions for democracy. You know,
we're hearing eminent, distinguished, we're expecting somebody much older. So it's amazing how much you've been able to do at such a young age. Some of the, if you pick apart the different parts of your presentation, in some of them you're very optimistic, but some of them you're very pessimistic. So give us some ideas on how you would, if you were made the Secretary of State, how you would approach, say, the Pakistan issue.
Well, it is difficult because as much as I, you know, appreciate calling a spade, as I acknowledged in my speech, there are geopolitical realities that we have to deal with, particularly while the Afghan war is going on. Once that operation is over with, I believe the United States has much more room to fundamentally reevaluate our situation. As of right now, what can the United States do with Pakistan? Perhaps we can remind them that that day will come, that at some point in not too distant a future, the United States will not be as reliant on Pakistan as it is today, and it will not have these dependencies. And perhaps we could be more open about what the possible consequences are going to be for Pakistan if it continues this type of behavior. You know, there are examples. Iran provides an example of a government whose organs, the state organs, support terrorism. And we have not been without options with Iran. You know, individual members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps have been targeted for U.S. sanctions. If individual members of the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate